Distinguished lecture series in groundwater science, fosters interest and excellence in groundwater science and technology. It was established in 1986 and named in honor of Henry Darcy of France for his 1856 investigations that established the physical basis of groundwater hydrology. Every year, a panel of scientists selects the Darcy lecturer, who then goes on to give a series of presentations across the US and the world. Our speaker, who I have not yet introduced, will be giving 80 presentations during the course of this year. And in fact, 4 of them this week, coming from University of Minnesota yesterday, and then giving 2 in Michigan later this week. So this is a really important series and a position that has a lot of influence on future hydrogeologists and hydrologists of all flavors. If you look at the name of people who have done this in the past, it's a true who's who of people in groundwater hydrology. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Becker. Matt is the Distinguished Conrey Endowed Chair in Hydrogeology at University of California State in Long Beach. Probably getting less snow, I would imagine.
Yeah, a little less.
In Long Beach today. Before being at Long Beach, he was a faculty member at University at Buffalo. He also worked for the USGS, Chevron, and Los Alamos. He has his PhD and master's in civil engineering from the University of Texas, Austin, and a BS in geology from Michigan State University. The primary research focus of Matt is fluid flow in highly heterogeneous subsurface environments. He's been a true pioneer in distributed sensing, both distributed temperature sensing and distributed acoustical sensing, and lots of other flavors of alpine and coastal hydrogeology, hydrogeophysics, and if I continue to talk about all of the important work and fun topics that he's been involved in researching, I think I'd use up all of his time. So I won't do that, but I'll instead pass it over to Matt Becker.
Thank you, Steve. Well, thank you all for inviting me here. I always love coming here. It's great to be back. And this topic that I'm going to talk about, as Steve suggested, is not what I've done historically. My background was more like fractured rock hydrology and contaminant transport and things like that. So this is sort of an illustration for you grad students to just never say no. So this came because I was sitting on a surfboard next to my friend from university who's an archaeologist, and I won't give you the whole story, but he said, hey, we could really use some help. And so I went, and then that turned into something, and that turned into something. And the next thing you know, we're working in French Polynesia on these islands. So this is not traditionally what I was trained to do, but it's actually turned out to be really fun and good science, I think. So I want to start actually with a little quiz, right? We all use map apps, and when you use your map app, you have a choice, right? You can set your map app to map view, and you can set your app to turn-by-turn view, right? Now, not everybody agrees on this. My wife and I do not agree on this, and we fight over who gets to the app first. But I'm curious, and I've been asking this all over the country, how many people are map view on their app? All right, a few. Yeah. And then the rest of you are turn-by-turn view, I assume. Yeah, because you have no other choice. Yeah, that's cool. You get a different answer depending on which crowd you're with, especially geology and geography training. But so James Cook, who was the famous navigator and explorer who explored the South Pacific, left England with this map, and it's a pretty standard map for all of us. It's got latitude and longitude. A lot of it hadn't been drawn in because things had not been discovered by the Europeans anyway, and so he came to Tahiti, and you can see Tahiti here, and there's the Marquesas. Hawaii hadn't been discovered by the Europeans. We're going to be talking about Tahiti and Rapa Nui today, or Easter Island. But as I said, this is a pretty familiar map to all of us, and we could all use this to get around. So when James Cook got to Tahiti, he recruited a navigator who was Polynesian, and this guy was something of a sage and a priest in the Society Islands, and he knew the location, he said, of 90 or more South Pacific islands. So Cook said, "This is great, come with us on our trip and help navigate us." So they went off to the south. He had secret orders to try to find this southern continent, and but he lost confidence in Tuapea really quickly. And one of the reasons why is because he asked Tuapea to make a map. He said, "Show us where your islands are on a map." And so Tuapea made a map, and it looked like this. And this is actually Cook's copy of Tuapea's map. The original doesn't exist. But here's Tahiti, right? The Marquesas are down here, Rapa Nui's over here, Oahu, which hadn't been known by the Europeans, is over here, but we would think it would be up here, right? So everything's kind of in the wrong place. And you see on this map, you've got east, north, south, west, just like Cook's map, but Tuapea did not draw that on his map. Cook put that on that map, because that's his mapping system. What Tuapea put on his map was Awatea, which is noon. So the center of Tuapea's map is noon, not the coordinates, because the Polynesians didn't see things in a static way. They don't see the world in a static way. Their navigational systems were not static. Turn-by-turn view is a pretty poor analogy of what the incredibly complex navigational system that they had. But essentially they would follow currents in one direction and the winds in another direction, and these would all change at different times of the year when the stars were coming up over different parts of the horizon. So nothing was really static to them. And so it's amazing to me that two of the greatest navigators in the world at this time, James Cook and Tuapea, could be on a tiny little boat in the ocean for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time and still not understand each other's navigational systems. They could not communicate those concepts. So I raise this point because we're going to see a few examples. I'm going to first talk about the people of Rapa Nui and their water resources, and then we'll get to water resources and reefs. But all through this, you'll see that there's a disconnect between the knowledge of the Polynesians and the Europeans that came later. In fact, the Polynesians were amazing navigators. They came out of Southeast Asia and hung around for kind of close to that area for 1,000 years, and then they just sort of exploded into the South Pacific. And they sailed around on these double-hulled canoes. This is the Hokulea, which is a reconstruction of a Polynesian canoe. And for many years, European, American archaeologists, anthropologists didn't believe that the Polynesians could navigate this way. They said that they were blown off course and found all these islands by accident. And this canoe and the navigator, Polynesian navigator that was guiding it, demonstrated that in fact they could go anywhere they wanted, anytime they wanted, by using these navigational methods. So the Polynesians are very important. You can't really talk about the South Pacific without talking about the Polynesians. We're going to look at two islands near Tahiti and then Rapa Nui. So we'll start with Rapa Nui, which is also known as Easter Island because it was discovered by a Dutch explorer on Easter Day, and so it became known as Easter Island. It's a volcanic island. It's not very high. It doesn't have reef development, so we're not going to be talking about the reefs because it's too cold that far south. And of course, it's famous for its statues, right? We see the statues often as just heads, but that's because the ones that are heads in this picture are still in the quarry. They haven't been removed. In fact, they only carved full-size statues. So of course, they had to move these statues around, and they weighed many tons. And there was a lot of theories about how these things moved, and one of them was that the Rapa Nui denuded the entire island of trees just so they could roll these statues around. These are the kinds of ideas that get floated around among the archaeologists. But if you actually ask the Polynesians how they moved these things, they said that the tradition is, the oral history is that they walked. And so the archaeologists say, oh, that's a cute story. Like, how did you move them? And so then they go back to, practicing with these giant levers and rollers and all this kind of stuff. But my colleague that I work with out here, my surfing buddy that I ended up going out here with, actually demonstrated in fact, they did walk. That this is the way they move the statues, and you can demonstrate this. They made a model. This is actually a small model that was used as practice, but they have little tails on the back of them that help them walk like this, and they get carved off when you put them on the platform. So sometimes you find these things face down in the road, because once they fall face down, you can't get them back up. And there are all kinds of theories about how, the Jared Diamond has these theories about how they destroy the ecosystem and so forth, and that's why there are all these knocked over statues. They just fell over, actually. But again, it's sort of underestimating the Polynesians, that they were there for a couple hundred years. They denuded the island, and then they were fine for another 600 years or so. So they needed water, of course, and that's where we come in. We're interested in the water resources on this island. There are only a few volcanic lakes. There's no surface runoff to speak of. There are a couple springs here and there, but the settlements are clearly all over the island. So we were looking for their water source. Now, if you ask the Europeans, you look at the records of, here's a quote, for example, from a naturalist on Cook's voyage. They said that Rapa Nui drank seawater, and that was the solution. Because when they came there and asked for water, they would have none to give them. And here's a picture I took of a horse drinking seawater. Well, we know that's not possible, of course, right? Nobody can drink seawater. Even horses cannot drink seawater. So what are they drinking? Well, it's fresh water seeping out along the coast and floating on top. And so what they're drinking is groundwater. These are groundwater resources that are all merging along the coastline. So based on these historical accounts and based on our own measurements, we started surveying all the springs that we could find, and that red zone is our research area. To the west is Hydrogeology, which is developed, so we just sort of worked in the less developed area. And all the dark blue points on there where we found springs that had salinity of less than 9 parts per thousand. So 9 parts per thousand is the most saline we can drink, because that's basically the salt content of our blood. Right? If you drink anything more saline than that, it dehydrates you. So we wouldn't want to drink that. That's not great, and they probably didn't want to drink that either. So it's likely that there were structures that would cool this freshened seeps and make them even fresher. And there are some structures that still survive that we see that some of these were quite ingenious. So this is a sort of thing of an interception trench. So if you imagine and I'll talk more about this later, but if you have fresh water floating on top of the seawater, as it moves toward the coast, it's getting pushed up near the ground, and so this is designed to sort of scrape that water off the top, if you will. They want the most shallow water because that's going to be the freshest. And so back in the day, it would be a little bit deeper, and then they would pull water from this. So there were similar kind of remaining structures. Now they have wells, so obviously they don't use this water as they used to. But here's sort of a big pool, a larger example of one of these seeps behind Tegariki, which is one of the largest platforms in the island. And then the farmers actually would find some of these old wells, and they would put trash pumps in them so that they could water their horses. And so we see these trash pumps, the hose would go all the way up to the road, and we'd sort of follow them down, and this is one of the ways that we could find these little puna, these little wells. We started noticing, however, as you can see in these pictures, that we would find these wells behind the platforms of statues, the ahu. Even when those ahu were up on a cliff, right, and so down below, we would go down looking for seeps, and sure enough, we would find some seeps that had been historically, in ancient times, it looks like there was some rocks built up, and then the farmers would actually reinforce those with cement so that they could keep gathering water, again, usually just for their horses. And you can kind of see, it's a little hard to see, there's a little platform up here, there's another one up here. These are all sites, archaeological sites with platforms of statues. So we began wondering, could the statues be located in the position of these groundwater seeps? Bo DiNapoli, who was a student for Carl Lippo, my colleague, an archaeologist colleague, did a really excellent statistical study, and he looked at the correlation between the position of the Yahoo that you can see in red, so there's actually a lot of statues on this island, and the position of our water seeps that we mapped. And then he also looked at confounding variables like access to sea, because they would gather shells and seafood from the shorelines and so forth. So it wasn't correlated to access, it wasn't correlated to some other variables, but it was highly correlated to water. And so it does appear that these famous statues are there somehow signaling the presence of water. So, it could be convenience. Maybe they just built these big platforms because they had a water source there, but that seems unlikely. They were much more thoughtful about where they did these things. So apparently it's some signaling of water resources, and the oral history doesn't exist to know exactly what it meant. But what I want you to remember from this is that next time you see those statues, think groundwater. That's what they're there for. So let's take a look at the physics behind this. Those of you who've taken hydrogeology, you've probably heard about Geiger-Herzberg, right? This relationship just from static buoyancy, that if your water level in your well, fresh water level in your well is a meter above sea level, then the interface down to the brackish zone, the seawater zone, is 40 meters deep. So it's a 40 to 1 ratio. But this is, of course, just a static relationship. Once water moves, that begins to fall apart, and it only occurs in homogeneous settings. And so when you have heterogeneous geology, when do we not have heterogeneous geology, right? This kind of falls apart. So your classic freshwater lens floating on top of seawater looks something like this. And here's a cross section that's very famous from Oahu. And they have this giant freshwater lens, and they the water resources either come from dammed water that's trying to make its way down to that lens. It's dammed by these dike intrusions, or they drill right down into this freshwater lens. However, we were very interested in this coastal discharge, which complicates things a little bit, because we have to think about how the water moves to the coast. And we were interested first because of the people, but now we're going to shift over to looking at the influence on the reefs. So we know that the reefs get nutrients from groundwater. We know that reefs could potentially get alkalinity from groundwater. And so there's an important connection between this terrestrial groundwater and the reefs. Before we get into that, let's make sure we're on the same page about these islands. So we're talking about volcanic islands in the South Pacific. And most of you, I'm sure, know that you get a hot spot underneath a plate that builds up a volcano, right? And as the plate moves on, then that volcano begins to sink slowly under isostatic, under its own weight, essentially, depressing the plate. And so it slowly sinks, millimeters per year, not really fast. But as it does, the reefs around them build up. And so what you end up with is you transition from a volcanic island to an atoll eventually, where that volcanic, all of the salt is well below the ocean level, and there's nothing sticking up but carbonate. Right? So you transition to very, very different hydrogeologic regimes through this process. So we're going to look at two islands. One is Moorea. It's a high island, so-called because the volcano is still sticking up. And that's somewhere between a fringing and a barrier reef. So you can see that as this progresses, the reef kind of moves away from the shore. And then we're going to look at an atoll. And so down here, this is nothing but carbonate. So all this work is done with my close collaborator at Long Beach State, Ben Hagedorn. He's more the chemistry guy, and more the water flow guy, so we make a pretty good team. So let's start with Moorea. So it's 1,200 meters high, and as you can see, it's got quite a bit of reef around it. On the east side, you have more barrier reefs, and on the west side, it's more fringing reefs, because it's sort of in between those two. And we work mostly on the west side, on the fringing reef. There is a station there supported by UC Berkeley. They have a long-term ecological research site where they study the reef. And so there's a lot of studies being done in Moorea. Otherwise, it's a very popular tourist destination where you have newlyweds showing up with husband and wife t-shirts and annoying stuff like that. But it is a really amazing location for looking at hydrology. It gets 3 meters of rainfall a year. It gets quite a bit of rainfall. A lot of that is, influenced by topography. So here is a DEM where it's from a French Polynesian atlas where they've delineated all the channels, basically just using the typical DEM analysis, right? And you can see that there should be a lot of runoff there, but except when it's actually raining and very shortly thereafter, very few of these actually continue to flow. The water percolates very quickly into the volcanics, just like it did on Rapa Nui. And from our survey, and this was only one snapshot, these are the only ones that we could see. There's a road that circles the whole island that actually were perennial, that we could count on actually having water in after it hadn't rained for a while. So clearly the runoff is not all surface water. Right? So it goes to the groundwater. Then where does it go? Well, we figured it was going to go seep to the coastline, just like it did in Rapa Nui. So we went looking for that. We looked at salinity, we looked at temperature, we used radon 222, which is a really excellent tracer of groundwater, and came up with very little along the coastline. So most of it looked like this, just a few shots of radon here and there that indicated there might be a little bit of seepage. There was one location that the Polynesians told us about, that the folks in Maria told us about, that they knew was a really kind of a well-known spring site, and so we used one of those as our study area. And in fact, where there was flow, we did see radon 222 and salinity drop and all that stuff. So the methods were fine. There's just not a lot of water seeping out along the coast. So that was a bit of a mystery. It's not surface water. It's not seeping at the coast. It's got to go somewhere. So the only other choice is that it goes below the reef, that it's going deeper. So then we started looking below the reef. We used electrical resistivity. And so this is just like the same technology you use on the land. It just use different cables. You can float them on the surface. You can put them on the bottom. And if you're not familiar with this, you're injecting current through the subsurface and you measure the voltage drop, and that gives you resistance, right? Electrical resistance. So freshwater water is more resistant than seawater. So we're using this to see if there's anything that looks like freshwater underneath this reef. So this is what we found in our very early surveys. The seawater here, we're looking at conductance that converted the resistance to conductance. So the seawater is very conductive, of course, in red. And then the green is brackish, it's a little freshened. And then in the blue, it's even fresher. Right? And so we found in many of these surveys, we found resistive features underneath, at least part of the reef. Not everywhere. You can see here that this is essentially the seawater saturated sediment. But this was our missing water. Right? At least one in solution there is missing water. The groundwater is underrunning the reef. And this has important implications for looking at the flux of the chemistry that's being carried by that water. We're working with Mrs. Silberger, who's now at University of Hawaii, and she wanted to study the effect of groundwater on the growth of corals. And she's like, buy me some groundwater so I can put my microcosms out. We're like, we can't find any. So we kept looking, and we started trying to understand how the water was flowing underneath this reef. So we did a lot more resistivity, and in this case, we actually did sort of a three-dimensional one, and you could see these plumes, right? The water was moving, the fresh water was moving sort of as a plume. This is like a resistive feature, and it doesn't extend everywhere, just in this little spot. Now this is that one area that I told you that we knew that there were lots of springs. It's very unusual on the island. The only one that we have actually had anybody tell us that, yeah, there are springs there. So there are beach springs. There are seeps that are out at the edge of the fringing reef, and there are actually even places where the fresh water is coming up through the reef a little bit. So this is all geophysics, but we went and collected samples as well. So when we started trying to auger down through this stuff, we would always hit a rock lithified unit. So we cored down through it. We used a gas-operated coring rig and installed piezometers. And sure enough, we found some freshened water. This is the day that we first, that's Ben, my collaborator, and our students, and this is the first day that we found fresh water under there, so we're pretty excited. And then we just kept drilling through everything that we can. And when we pulled up the cores, as I said, we hit this rock, and we pulled up the cores, we got this. We got this thin little layer, and so here's the top of the core, here's the bottom. We get this very little lithified layer. So there's maybe 20 centimeters of coral rubble on top of this, and then this highly cemented, this is basically just cemented coral rubble. And then there's this zone underneath that was all broken up, right? So poor recovery here. And then sometimes we find something slightly more lithified below, but not like this. And so this is what is holding the fresh water underneath the reef, right? It's buoyant. There's no reason for fresh water to be under that reef unless it's confined. It's just this thin little layer that seemed to be confining the water next to the shore. We don't quite know how it forms, but it's always thin and it's always right underneath the water column. So our working hypothesis is that we've got supersaturated calcium carbonate or aragonite in the water column, and then we've got groundwater flowing underneath, so the groundwater is constantly sort of dissolving it out, and then you've got this gradient of carbonate precipitation. And if you look at this stuff, you can see it's stained and it's crumbled up, and so it looks pretty karstic. Right? It's all carbonate. That's not surprising. Now, we didn't find anything in the literature that shows that these things are supposed to occur around high islands, but we did find in the literature that it occurs fairly commonly in atolls. And on atolls, these features are pretty well known, and they dig down through them to get to the fresh water. So apparently they also form around these high islands, or at least the one that we're working on. So we're still chasing the water. So now we know that it doesn't seep out right along the coast. It goes under the reef, but how far does it go? So now we got to get way out of the reef. These reefs about 1 kilometer wide. And so we use a slightly different method, and this is a towed electrical resistivity array. So you're doing the same thing as I showed you before, but you're pulling it behind a boat. We can only go in the boat channels. The coral heads are too high to go anywhere you want. But we could do a lot of surveying in a day using this boat towed method. It's not quite as accurate as the static method, because you can't vary your offset of your electrodes as much, but you get a profile. And so this is what we got. We found way offshore, here's the path that we took, and we did this in 2 different directions to demonstrate to ourselves that we could repeat it. And we get these resistive features. The red are resistive features. So this is potentially fresh water. We don't have cores down through this, so we haven't been able to confirm it. But otherwise, it would have to be completely cemented up coral, which doesn't make a lot of geologic sense. It looks like it's all really like a really thick layer, but it's the artifact of the resistivity. There's really just these resistive features, but they're much deeper than what we were seeing before with the reef flat plate. Now we're talking 7 to 10 meters deep. So this is a little different. Something else is confining this water underneath the reef. So this is our conceptual model. We have this fresh water coming out to the shore. It gets trapped underneath that reef flat plate. And maybe in places it actually percolates up through that reef. Very occasionally we would actually find some seeps where you walk around and you feel something cold on your toes on the reef. It was very unusual. But that may actually help distribute some of the water to the reef, right? So we want to know what that flux is to the reef. And then we have this deeper system, apparently, and it gets trapped 7 to 10 meters deep, and we think that's below something called the third discontinuity. And what that is basically the contact between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. At lower sea stands, the Pleistocene coral was karstified, and so it's very permeable. And then the Holocene's on top of that, and it confines it a little bit. So this has been seen on some atolls where you look inland for seawater lenses, or freshwater lenses. So we're continuing to work on this. We're shifting now, and I'm going to talk about the atolls next. But I wanted to mention that this is something that has been developing all over the place. Here are some results, for example, from the Big Island in Hawaii. And they have some deep boreholes, hundreds of meters deep. And then they also have EM methods of looking much deeper than we can for these resistive features. And they find what they think are pockets of fresh water. Now this is not in the reef, this is down in the volcanics. But study after study now is starting to show that you can get these offshore reservoirs of water, and apparently these are something that occur around high islands. So I started saying, well, what about alkalinity? Why do we care about alkalinity, first of all? Well, because of ocean acidification. We know the ocean's going to get more acidic, right? So the idea is that if you have alkalinity fluxes from the terrestrial environment, it might help buffer some of the acidification on the reef flat itself. So we started looking at the chemistry of various seeps that we sampled and wells that we sampled. And this is a plot of dissolved inorganic carbon, so this is essentially increasing alkalinity. This is a plot of carbon-13, so this is organic source and this is less organic source carbon. And so the answer to that question is, does the groundwater produce alkalinity? It depends very much on where the water is coming from. If you look at the source water up in the volcanics, it's high in organics, very low in alkalinity, of course, because it's just salt. If you look at some of the beach piezometers, it's got quite a bit of alkalinity. So if you have beach seeps, it all percolates through this coral sand, so not surprisingly, it's got quite a bit of alkalinity. But the faster that water moves, the lower the alkalinity is. So when you have these like focused beach seeps that we found in one location, you have quite low alkalinity. So again, we're back to understanding the pathways to be able to elucidate what the fluxes are going to be to this reef. We know they can be very important. We know that nutrient fluxes, for example, to the Great Barrier Reef, this is not our study, but even in a place that has a fair amount of surface water flow, groundwater can be produce 10 times the flux of nutrients to reefs than surface water. Right? So we know that the submarine groundwater discharge, the groundwater fluxes can be important. So let's take a look at how this plays out on an atoll. So conveniently, this is also near Tahiti. So this is Moorea that we looked at previously, and now we're up here on this little atoll. So the volcanic island is now 150 meters below sea level. Right? It's just carbonate sticking up. So all this is just live reef, and then debris that's been ripped up from the live reef and kind of dumped down to these little motu or islands. And so this island in particular was, of course, settled by the Polynesians. It was more of a retreat than any place they actually lived. But then it became a coca plantation, and then it was bought by the actor Marlon Brando. Some of you may know from The Godfather. And back in the day, these are like the richest people. There's no Elon Musk. These were the richest people around, the Hollywood movie stars. And so he made this movie out in the South Pacific, Mutiny on the Bounty. He just fell in love with the islands, and perhaps more significantly, he fell in love with his co-star, who was Polynesian. And so he bought this island, and he lived on it for decades. So it turns out Brando was really an ecologist. His son still lives there, and we see him all the time. And he says toward the end of his career, his dad was just acting to pay for the work he wanted to do on this island. And so when he died, he left the island partially to this very exclusive resort. So you all can go vacation there. It's only $3,000 a night for a bungalow. And but also he insisted that there be the development of an eco station. So the Tetiaroa Society was developed, and they built an eco station. This is where you can work out on this island. So thanks to Marlon Brando, this has turned into a big ecological experimental site. And it looks a little bit like this. I take this picture because in the foreground we have sort of the smallest motu, and it's really little more than a sandbar. And then in the background we have the larger motus, so that's Rimatu in the background. So you're seeing this big one in the background. And so you have this huge variety of islet types, but I wanted to focus right now on the birds here. You can see how many birds are even on this tiny little island. So not all the motus have birds on them. The birds are very important because, of course, This is the answer to Darwin's paradox. How do these beautiful, abundant, fecund, islands exist in this ocean desert of nutrients, right? And the answer is because the birds are pulling the nutrients out of the ocean and literally dumping them on the motu, right? They nest there and they drug tons of guano, and that guano comes with nitrate and phosphorus, and this is what the reefs need. So the model is that you have runoff into the ecosystem, and you can see it just drives the whole cycle. This is what causes or what allows these reefs to form. However, when the Polynesians showed up, they brought rats with them. They brought the Polynesian rat, which is bad, and then the Europeans brought the European rat, Rattus rattus, which is worse. And both of them are voracious, and they eat the bird eggs. And so when they eat the bird eggs, this cycle is disrupted, and you have fewer birds nesting on the islands, or at least able to produce much in the way of population. And of course, the nitrate loads are decreased. And there have been lots of studies. If you look at atolls that have rats on them versus atolls that don't have rats on them, the reefs are much healthier on atolls where the rats were never introduced. So, here's an experiment that we can conduct on Tetsuroa. What if there were no rats, hypothetically? Well, you can take that hypothetical to reality and kill every damn rat on the island, and that's what they did. They poisoned all the rats on the island. They put poison out every 10 meters, cut their way through the forest, and when a rat shows up, they send out a student with a gun, and he shoots it. And so now we can see what's going to happen when the birds come back. Now, where do we come into this? We're hydrologists, we're groundwater people, right? Well, it's these arrows. You see the arrows? This is what runoff looks like to a biologist, right? Here's all the nutrients, there's the reef, whoop, here we go. There's no surface water on any of these motus. They're just coral mounds, right? So everything is groundwater. The only way to get nutrients from the motu to the reef is groundwater. And of course, we know that things can get complicated when you look at groundwater. So I'll get to that in a second, but I want to show you what I'm talking about. Sometimes this is loud. Let's see what happens. When I talk about bird populations. Okay, there's no sound. So this is the one islet on Tetsuroa that, for whatever reason, doesn't have rats. Never had rats. And this is what the natural environment looks like when there are no rats. Can you see the eggs? Egg, 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 egg. You literally cannot walk without being very careful because there are just eggs everywhere. And then there are angry little chicks that don't want you there. And so, this is the difference we're talking about. We're not talking about a subtle difference in birds. It's the populations become massive in these breeding grounds. So there's plenty of nitrate. We got to get it to the reef. Now, we have deposition of nitrate here, percolates down into the groundwater. Maybe there's a little runoff right at the beach. But at least in this study, Anne Lorraine, who we work with a little bit, she recognizes that this is a groundwater pathway. Okay. However, what do we know? We know that if the water is oxidized and you put nitrate on it, you have aerobic conditions, the nitrate goes out to the reef, reef's happy. I apologize to the geochemists, okay? I know they get a little insulted when I put the happy face on there, but but what happens when we have anaerobic, when we have reducing conditions, we get denitrification, a lot of that just goes to nitrogen gas, and we don't have the fluxes out to the reef, right? So we need to look at the groundwater to actually know how much of this is going to get to the reef to be able to understand what the removal of all those poor rats is going to do to the reef health. So we started digging more holes. And you can see the little points on this map where we did a bunch of sampling. And the reason why they're all on the inside of the lagoon there is just that's where we could auger. On the outside, you get clasps being ripped up from the reef, and you can't auger down through them. So our sampling was a little biased to start off with. But we did quite a bit of it. And We recently actually sent out a mud rotary rig. That's a so-called portable mud rotary rig. It's 1,400 pounds, so it could be a little bit more portable. And now we can actually start drilling down through this. So we're starting to get a better idea of the profile of the chemistry on the island. So I just want to show you, first of all, what kind of differences we're talking about in the loading. Okay, so this is the island I showed you before with the birds on it. The shallow water has 3,400 parts per million nitrate. That's like toxic waste. That's a lot of nitrate, right? This little island that also has a lot of birds on it doesn't have rats on it. And the reason why it doesn't have rats is it gets overwashed. So when there's a big storm, the whole thing just turns into seawater, and then it comes back as fresh water. And it has a lot of nitrate because there are birds, but quite a bit less than this one because it hasn't had a chance to build up. Here's an island that has rats historically and not much in the way of bird population. You can see it's several orders of magnitude lower in terms of nitrate. So we anticipate that now that the rats are gone, the nitrates are going to come up. How much gets to the reef? Well, here's a couple of measurements from one of the MO2. We'll just look at the MW1 here, the blue hole, and we auger down through this one. We're able to auger down and collect samples as we went down. So we'll just look at this blue curve here. And so what we're seeing on the left is ORP, oxidation reduction potential. And if you're basically in this zone, if you're here or below, you're going to get denitrification, right, because of the reducing conditions. Anything below that, then you go into sulfate formation, and you can smell rotten eggs and so forth. But basically, this is kind of the cutoff. And what you see is, like, at shallower depths, you have fairly oxidizing conditions, and then it becomes reducing with depth. If you look at the nitrate profile, you can see it's a complete mirror image of the reduction situation, the ORP, right? So if you don't have oxidizing conditions, you're not going to see nitrate getting to the reef. So all the fluxes calculations that they're doing now, or before we showed up and started complaining, weren't accounting for this. So what we're going to try and do now is get a better picture of that chemistry. However, this is where our reef flat plate friend comes back. Right? This is a study that was done on another atoll back in the 80s, and they found that these reef flat plates don't tend to extend all the way over the atoll. Right? So why are we worried about this? Well, imagine you have recharge coming into this coral atoll, MO2, and it hits the reef flat plate, right? It's going to be very shallow. Where it extends underneath the island, it's only less than a meter deep, right? So it's going to probably be quite oxygenated, and it's going to run off to the reef on this reef flat plate and probably contain nitrate, right? If it hits the deeper zone, this is more like what we measured on Conrey, where we have the reducing conditions with depth. So again, we're stuck with figuring out the heterogeneity of the hydrogeology to be able to understand the geochemistry that we think we're going to see as this island is restored. So it's a ton of fun because we're working with biologists all the time, and we just sit around and drink rum at the little bar that this cranky French guy runs, and just blow each other's minds. Like, I don't know anything about biology, they don't know a whole lot about hydrology, so it's so fun. And you learn stuff that you would never expect. So just another couple of connections that I think are cool for ecohydrology. Coconut trees per tree use more water than the native vegetation like Pisonia. Okay? And then when you make a coca plantation, of course you plant them quite densely, so now it's using more water. So that wasn't terribly surprising. What I didn't know is that these Pisonia tend to have this microbial relationship with their roots, and that relationship causes a slightly acidic soil. Right? So the soil in a Pisonia forest is a couple points lower in pH than the soil water, say, under a coca forest. So what? Well, for example, the oral history, again, listening to the Polynesians, Hinana Murphy, who's the local expert on this, she has oral history from a number of people that say that there used to be sinkholes on these MO2. And you could take a waterlogged coconut, and you could drop it into a sinkhole, and it would show up in a lagoon in a discharge. Those things do not exist anymore. we've been all over that place, and rangers are all over that place, and those things do not exist anymore. So it seems like not only is the chemistry and the ecosystem changing, but even the geology of the island may be affected by changing the vegetation. We don't know this for sure, but I've learned to trust Hinano in her discussion of history. And I can tell you a ton of other stuff that she knows. Her knowledge is amazing. And so the effect of this is that when the Pisonia are gone and the coconuts are added, the birds also stop nesting because they don't want to nest in those coconut forests. So now they're trying to figure out how to restore that part, because when you pay $3,000 a night for a bungalow, you want to see some palm trees, right? There's another island where they're doing a similar experiment called Palmyra. It's an old Air Force base, and they killed all the rats, and they killed all the coconut trees. So there's a bunch of just sticks sticking up right now on Palmyra. And so they're going to find out what happens when you change both of these. So there's a lot of work being done in this eco-hydrology regime that's really, really interesting. One final note on a larger scale. We know, as I said, I started off saying that the ocean is going to become more acidic, of course, as carbon dioxide concentrations go up. So this is a neat study that was published in Science, and what they did is they looked at the aragonite saturation state surrounding a whole bunch of reefs throughout the world. So I've circled Morea just to show you as reference, because you know that one now. And you can sort of see where the bars extend kind of in between net precipitating and net dissolving. So the pH is such that right now, they're more or less in an equilibrium between precipitation and dissolving. However, if you look to 2050 or 2100, if you look at the predictions of carbon concentration in the atmosphere, and then look at what that's going to do to the ocean, you're going to find most of these are going to be in a net dissolving state. Right? So obviously this is a problem for the live reef, but also we don't know what that's going to do to the carbonate geology of the low tube either. So lots of threats, of course, to these atolls. The maximum elevation of Tetiaroa is only like 10 meters above sea level. So first, they're already starting to see swells that are overwashing more than they ever used to see. And so these reefs and these terrestrial environments are in peril. We don't really understand, there's a lot of work being done on overwashing now from a hydrologic point of view. But as I said, some of these little islands already get overwashed and they just sort of come back. So we don't know what's going to happen as the overwash continues to the nitrate flux and the phosphorus flux to the reefs. So to summarize, all I want you to really remember about the Rapa Nui is that when you see those statues, think groundwater, right? We should make that the new symbol for NGWA is going to be the Rapa Nui statue. And for the reefs, I guess the lesson there is there's so much work to be done. I think folks like Steve and others that work on eco-hydrology have the right idea. Hanging out with biologists actually turns out to be more fun than I could ever expect. So hopefully some of you will pursue these areas. Steve mentioned the Darcy Lecture Series, so I won't go through that again, other than to thank them very much for this opportunity. I'm having the time of my life. It's a little bit exhausting, but it's so fun. I can't tell you how much fun it is. This is how much fun it is. I guess this is going to be my year. So I think I'm on number 29 or something like that out of the 70 visits. And NGWA is a great opportunity for students. Unlike AGU and GSA, which is mostly about science, NGWA, they have drillers, they have consultants. These are the people that are using the stuff that you're going to do. So it's great to be connected. And as a student, it's free to be a member. So what's the downside, right? It's free. So there's the QR code if you want to take that, but it's just ngwa.org/students. So I really encourage you, students, to get involved if you're not already. And I'll leave that up there just in case somebody wants to capture that QR. And that's what I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for a fascinating talk, and I think for providing a compelling alternative to just saying no. Get involved in things. Since we're over in the geoscience building, I will adopt the standard practice here of allowing students to have the first couple questions, if there are any.
Feel the pressure.
I think it's a good tradition.
I think it's a good tradition if they ask questions. No? There we go. Thank you for not making me stand here. Feel
What's
sad.
going on with the western half of Rapanui? Why is there that?
The western half of Rapa Nui?
Yeah.
Oh, we just chose not to use it because it's more developed. So Hangaroa is like, where everybody lives and everything, so.
In the map of the statues, it looked like there weren't any on the western side either.
It might have been just because we limited it to our study area.
Okay.
There are statues over there. There are actually not as many, but it may be that, they were reused for, construction purposes and stuff. We don't actually know. But there are some nice platforms sort of in the southwest corner. You should go there, it's cool.
Yeah, so on Rapanui, when you were showing the dug wells,
Yeah.
how deep are they? And how do we know how they were dug through all of the basaltic?
They're only as deep as like just picking up rubble.
Okay.
Yeah, they had no way of, making wells. They had no way of actually even they had small gourds is the only container that they had. So even if there were water sources, they couldn't really move them around the island. They would make little depressions in rocks, carve those out, so that when it rained and they walked around the island, they could have a little bit of water. So they're very ingenious about the use of their water, but they could not really make wells. All they could do is move rocks around.
Do you think that adding the alkalinity flux to climate models will improve the outlook for
Adding the what flux, I'm sorry?
adding the alkalinity flux from groundwater? Do you think that'll help the climate models outlook on coral reefs?
Well, if there was a net alkalinity, yeah. There was a study on another island where they said that they found that there was an alkalinity flux, and there was another island where they found that it was a negative. It was actually less alkaline than the seawater. So we don't really know the answer to that. Of course, it depends on the residence side of that, because it does get circulated on and off the reef. So we don't know enough of the flux to know whether it would make a difference. Right now, it's sort of just a hypothesis. But certainly alkalinity would be helpful.
We can now open up questions to everyone. Anyone else has questions?
Yeah, I learned about reef flat plates today. So
Yeah.
how did those develop? Is there any sense over the time scale they develop and the geochemistry involved in that development?
We've been struggling with that because it's, so we've looked at, for example, trace elements, and there is a gradient of trace elements that indicate that on the bottom is groundwater and on the top is seawater. So we're pretty much confident about that. Now, whether that actually contributes to their formation, we're not entirely sure. We also, when we core down, we don't see like multiple reef plates from previous sea stands, right? So it seems like they only exist in this equilibrium, right now, or in recent times. And so that's why we think that it's sort of a modern formation. It's a little bit complicated by the fact that at our field site, the sea level was never more than about 1.5 meters higher than it is now. But these things are pretty ubiquitous all over atolls, and everybody finds them shallow. They don't find them much deeper, and they extend under the island, and then they come out into the reef, and they're just below the water level. That's what I got for you. We've looked at thin sections. We know this. The cement is very low in magnesium, which is a little bit of a surprise, given the aragonite in the seawater. But it's very low mag calcium carbonate. There's some people say that a similar thing develops in the Persian Gulf, and it's weird because the one term is reef flat plate, another one is hard grounds. Some people just call them hard grounds. I read a paper with 2 German authors. They said it was called the father layer, and then I figured out that the Polynesian word for this is papa. has nothing to do with father. It was a very lazy translation. So they started calling it. So I'm not even sure, people confuse it with beach rock. It's not even clear, like, the nomenclature of this. Because for carbonate geologists, it's just too thin, they don't care about it.
Just like a tiny little follow-up question, is there pretty good data that they're like really continuous?
Most of the data we have is like from studies that were done in the 80s. People have implied that they're there because they can't get their models, their groundwater models to, USGS did a model, and they had to put in the reflat plate. But no, there's not a lot of modern data. Sure.
Thanks, Matt, for showing how everything is interconnected. You showed how important groundwater is for building nutrients going to the sea and the whole ecology on those islands. But in terms of the big picture of global carbon balance and ocean acidification, I mean, these islands are tiny dots on a map.
Right.
So how much can it contribute to the overall ocean acidity?
Oh, the overall ocean? No, it would only be the reflat that we would think that would be important. And so we have the flux of the alkalinity coming off, the terrestrial zone, and then probably we have, tidal pumping of alkalinity coming out of the reef structure as well. But all that is, that's subject to whatever the circulation is in and off the reef. It would be completely dilute everywhere else. I should have pointed that out. Thank you for bringing that up.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we may have for questions, but before we thank our speaker, one last time, I do want to let those of you who may not be aware, we have Matt here for another 3 hours of meetings, and so there are group meetings. If you are not signed up for one but want to stop by, just come up here and I can tell you where those are at. And with that, let's thank Matt for a great talk. It's true. We can all do it.